We also have the Roman exile, where the Romans took over Judah, and they exiled us, put us in slavery, and then that gets us to kind of some of the time period that we're going to start going on. So, this is a gentleman. He is an African, or was an African. His name is Leo Africanus. He was a historian. He has a book where he went through Africa and he described all the lands, all the different people within Africa, and has a very, very extensive 3-volume book on on Africa. And he describes all the different people in 3 different volumes, and this was written in Arabic. So the translation of it, this is just something I picked out here from volume 1 of his book. It says, the Caphates being as black as pitch, right? So talking about these people, he said the Caphates being as black as pitch and as mighty that are and of a mighty stature, and some think descendant of the Jews, right? He telling us so that they're idolaters at this point, so they don't have the religion. But he said some people think that they're descendant of the Jews. So notice that he said that they were black as pitch, right? That wasn't odd for his time period. That was known. Look at the time periods, though. Pay attention to these time periods, and you're going to see where things switch, right? Just a hint, slavery started like around, like right after this, pretty much. Pretty much right after this, it started, the slave trade started. Huh? 1619 is when they brought the first slave supposedly into America, but yeah, supposedly into America, but the slave trade started well before then, and we'll talk about that for sure. You have a man named Barak Espinoza, or Barak Spinoza, and this is a description of this gentleman. He was a Jew in Spain, so a description of him from a man named Elus, whatever. I don't know how to pronounce his name. He's Yules. We'll go with that. He says he was of a middle size. He had good features in his face, the skin somewhat black, black curled hair, long eyebrows, and they were of the same color, so that one might easily know by his looks that he was a descendant of the Portuguese Jews. So we see black features. It was well known that he was a descendant from Portugal, right? The Jews in Portugal. So how did Jews get in Portugal? We'll look at Jordanes. All right, this is another historian. He's quite a bit earlier than these other two. Okay, so Jordanes, he says the Sawyers. This is another different type of people. Have swarthy features, and swarthy just means black. He said they have swarthy features and are usually born with curly black hair. They are like the Gauls or the Spaniards. All right, so Spain, if you look, Spain and Portugal are right next to each other, right on the same peninsula, right next to each other. So we see that it was acknowledged at this time, right, at 551, that people were black there, all right? So this is Leo Africanus again. We're going back to him. This is also in the volume 1 of his book. He says, not so much as the name of this malady, talking about a sexually transmitted disease, right? So he says, not so much as the name of this malady or this sickness was ever known in Africa before Ferdinand, the king of Castile, so the king of Spain, right? Ferdinand, the king of Castile, expelled all Jews out of Spain, right? So he kicked all the Jews out of Spain. He said before that happened, nobody knew about this sexual transmitted disease. He'll go on to explain. After the return of which, notice he says that, after the return of which, Jews into Africa, certain unhappy and lewd people lay with their wives. So he said there's people in Africa that after we returned there, they was unhappy about this, and they started laying with our wives. So they laid with their wives, and so at length that this disease spread from one to another over the whole region into Africa, insomuch that it is scarce that any family was free from the same. So he said this happened so much that everybody in Africa had this disease at one point, right? And so this is a sexually transmitted disease that they say happened only after the Jews returned into Africa. Remember the time period that he's looking at, right? So he's looking at, if you look at, we're going to talk about when they were expelled from Spain. He's an eyewitness. He lived exactly in that time period. So it's difficult for somebody who's, that's 1,000 years removed, 500 years removed, looking back to say No, that didn't happen. Right? When you have somebody who's a very respected person of history, right, who at that time says that Jews returned, right? So he acknowledged that they were already in Africa and then they came back, right? So now let's talk about the exiles, right? So this is an exile from the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is Spain and Portugal. So the exiles from Spain and Portugal. In 1492, right, Spain expelled Jews as part of the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition, are the Inquisitions in Rome. What they were pretty much the Pope would give approval for people to get cleaned out, right? They were typically, what we're taught right now is that it was directed at Muslims, but that's not entirely true. It was directed at black people, right? It just so happened that black people were Muslims and black people were Jews, right? So we got caught into it as well. When they got rid of us, they said, this is the Spanish Inquisition. Let's get them out of here. So they would take us, they would kill us, they would enslave us. Jews sought asylum. So after that happened in Spain, remember Spain, Portugal right next to each other? Then we sought asylum in Portugal. So at first, the Portuguese people, they was welcoming us. Remember, we're all the same people anyway. We're all over there too. So they were welcoming us. However, the Portuguese government decreed the enslavement of all Jews who had not left the country, and then they deported several hundred of their children to Sao Tome. Sao Tome just means Saint Thomas. Yeah, that's an island. So this is a Portuguese island that was created. They deported our children, right? They took our children and put them there. We're gonna talk a little bit more about this island, and I'll show you guys where it is. But they put our children there, and then they started enslaving us. So this is where it began. Portugal. Very important to remember that. Portugal, they started to enslave us first, and they just enslaved us at home because we were there. We all left Spain. When we left Spain, we either went into Africa or we went into Portugal. And why do you think we went into Africa? Because we blend in there, right? If we go up north, we stick out like a sore thumb. These inquisitions are going on all over, right? You go to the south and you go into Africa, and Africa is literally, you could just hop one little short boat ride, and you get right into Morocco, right? So you go right in there, and that was our people, right? Well, let's see. Sao Tome is right here. So this is West Africa. I'll tell you guys, I'll just do a spoiler. This is where the slaves were picked up from, right along this coast. This is what they call the slave coast. This is where Sao Tome is. It's a very small island right off of the coast of West Africa where all the slaves are picked up. This island is where our children first, once they discovered this island, they put our kids there as slaves, and they took children, right? We're going to go into it a little more. So this kind of zooms in on it, all right, and just kind of go into it. So now we're going to talk more about here. So continuing on with that history, following King John, so King John was a king in Portugal who enslaved the Jews. So following his death in 1494, the new king, Manuel I of Portugal, resorted the freedom of the Jews. So the Jews, that the king that enslaved us and sent our children to Sao Tome, he died. Then the next king came along and he gave us freedom, right? So he saw freedom for us. However, 3 years later, under the pressure of a newly born Spanish state, because he was getting married, and part of their marriage contract, he had to get rid of the Jews, and it was agreed upon between the Roman Catholic Church, the Queen of Spain, and they all kind of agreed on it. So as part of that agreement, King Manuel I had decreed that all Jews had to convert to Christianity or leave the country without their children. So remember what happened to our children. So that's why they had to leave without their children, because our children are going to end up going to Sao Tome. So they had to leave without their children. And he said after that, hard time. So we either converted or we had to leave. Most of us left. And then they have a whole history. I didn't document too much of it here, but they have a whole history about people who we will talk about it. I do have something on here. So we had to either convert or leave. We leave. Then it says hard times followed for the Portuguese Jews with the massacre of 2,000 individuals in Lisbon in 1506. further forced deportations to Sao Tome. All right, so we are forcefully deported to Sao Tome later on after that. And later, even more relevant establishment of Portuguese Inquisition. So now the Portuguese have their own Inquisition on top of them putting us in slavery. All right, so Inquisition is hunting people down. Right, you're kind of looking for them. Like you want to find them. Where are they? Make sure they're not there. Make sure we dealt with them. So these are kind of like just timelines. The Spanish Inquisition started 1478, 1834. The Portuguese Inquisition started 1536, 21. The slave trade began in the 15th century. So that would be the last half of the 15th century. So that would be like 1450, somewhere between 1450 and 1500, right? Then you have 1807. Britain and America claim to have ended the Atlantic slave trade, right? So that's 1807, they stopped it. 1810, Britain all this time had been trying to stop all the European countries to stop the slave trade. The Portuguese, however, they were like, well, you're not going to get us to stop completely, but we will agree not to do any slave trades above the equator. So they limited their slave trade, and that happened in 1810. Portugal finally stopped completely the slave trade in 1870. Look at these dates. The Inquisitions lasted the whole time of slavery. All right? Is that a coincidence? I think not.